Russia is firing cruise missiles at Ukraine. 3 nights and counting, there's been intense bombardment, and this offensive has claimed an unlikely victim: food grains. That's right, food is the new casualty of this war. Not the first time though, but on this occasion the crisis is grave. Russian missiles are hitting Ukraine and the impact is being felt all the way here in India. New Delhi has been forced to make some tough calls. India has banned the export of rice, and it's a very big deal because India is the world's biggest exporter of rice. And now it has stopped. This has led to panic in the global markets. Look at the headlines that went viral today. The West is worried about the consequences of India's move. They fear it will push up global prices and in turn worsen their cost of living crisis. So what is India's view? What's the strategy and how will it impact the world? We'll try to answer all these questions tonight, starting with how this crisis began. This week, Russia intensified the attacks on Ukraine. Their missiles hit the port of Odessa. For Moscow, these bombings are a retaliation, revenge for the attack on Crimea, which happened earlier this week. The Kerch Bridge was targeted. It is very important for Moscow. It connects Crimea with mainland Russia. Ukraine did not take responsibility for the strike, but Putin blames Kiev for what happened, and so he's striking back hard. The Russian attacks took lives. At least 2 people have died, more than 20 others were hurt. They also damaged large stocks of food. Some 60,000 tons of grain was burnt. Terminals and piers were damaged. And all of it had a bearing on the global markets. They went into a tizzy. Prices shot up dramatically, especially wheat. Wheat prices increased by more than 7%. This is the largest increase since February last year. Why such a sharp reaction? Why are the markets in panic? Because Moscow has called off the grain deal, the Black Sea Initiative. It was brokered by the United Nations. It allowed Ukraine to ship food grains to the world. Now Russia has pulled the plug. It says Ukraine is misusing this deal. Now the world was already suffering a shortage. Russia's move has made it worse. Before the war, Ukraine and Russia were key sources of grains for the whole world. We're talking about 1/4 of the world's wheat exports, 1/5 of the maize and barley exports. All of this came from Ukraine and Russia. But the war dealt a blow to this supply. The attacks on the Odessa port have made it worse. And what happens when there is a shortage? When traditional suppliers cannot lift the burden, what happens then? Someone else has to step in. So international buyers turn to India. But India does not have so much to spare, it seems. It has the world's largest population. It has to feed its people. Last year, India banned the export of wheat as well, and that ban still remains in place. Now India has banned rice too, the export of rice. This is spooking the world because India is the largest exporter. 40% of the world's rice needs are met through India. 140 countries get their rice from India. In 2022, India exported more than 22 million tons of rice. That's more supply than the next 4 exporters put together. Which are these next 4 exporters? Which countries? Thailand, Vietnam, Pakistan, and the United States. So you can see the demand. The orders are coming from everywhere, but now Indian rice is set to go out of the global market. Reports say some varieties can still be exported, but the ban includes 2 of India's largest export categories: non-basmati white and broken rice. Their export is banned. Some experts say they saw this coming because before the ban, India also tried to restrict these exports. Last year, a new export tax was introduced. All rice exports carried a 20% tax. Which brings us to the question, why is this being done? Why the ban? Like I said, India has its own demand to meet. Plus, there are shortages. Heavy rains have hit supplies. Prices in India are soaring. In the last 12 months, the price of rice has gone up by more than 11%. In the last month, the increase has been 3%. How do you tame this? By improving the supply. So the exports will have to take a back seat. Plus, we don't really know where this war is going, for how long it will go on, for how long the supply from Ukraine will remain disrupted. There is no clarity. So India is planning for the road ahead, striking a balance between export orders and domestic demand. And that's been the case since last year. In fact, when India banned the export of wheat, there was considerable global backlash. But India resisted that pressure. And now it has added rice to the list of banned items. You know what else is on this list? Sugar. Not a complete ban, but in September last year, India restricted the export of sugar too. Producers were given an export quota, 6.1 million tons. You cannot export more than that. And as of May this year, the month of May this year, Indian sugar mills had already consumed this entire export quota. Now, here's something you should know. These export bans are also signs of stress. India too is experiencing a cost of living crisis. It is not extreme as in the West, but prices of staples have seen a rise in India as well. For example, vegetable prices, they jumped by 12% between May and June. Our viewers in India would know about the tomato prices. There has been a 300% jump. Earlier, the cost of 1 kilo was about 25 rupees. Now it is well over 100. Floods in tomato producing states have led to a shortage. And overall, inflation is not cooling just yet. Last month, India's retail inflation shot up by 4.8%. This was a 3-month high. What is retail inflation? It deals with the prices of goods, the kind that you consume on a daily basis. They're becoming more expensive. Moral of the story, India is not immune to world events. Yes, the crisis is not half as bad as elsewhere, but prices are going up. Russian missiles are not just causing damage in Ukraine, they're also disrupting the global food market. And India is responding by looking after its own people first before helping the world. So tough times for the world. There is inflation, layoffs and pay cuts, but not for King Charles of Britain. Forget pay cuts, he's all set to receive a massive pay hike. The British monarchy has a budget of $110 million. By 2025, it will increase to $160 million, which is a 45% pay hike. How are Rishi Sunak and his government justifying this? By simply lying about it. Let me explain. The monarchy's budget is called the sovereign grant. Until the year 2011, the parliament controlled it. The MPs would decide how much money the royals would get. But that system has been changed. The new one is linked to profits. The monarchy has assets worth around $28 billion. This includes a lot of land and palaces. They're spread all across the UK. Now, assets generate profits, we know that, and the royal family gets a chunk of it, around 25%. So assume that the crown assets made $100 in profit. Then $25 of this would go to the monarchy. That's how it works. But in the latest report, the UK Treasury announced a change. The royals would not get 25% of the profit. They would only get 12%. How noble, right? The wise old king sharing his wealth with the subjects. Except he's not. Charles's share of the pie may become smaller, but the pie itself is now much bigger. Let me show you the numbers and explain. The crown's profit this year will be around $570 million, but next year it will double. The forecast is $1.3 billion. What explains this surge? Some royal land has been leased off for wind farms, and the payments will come in next year. So do you see what the British government has done? On paper, they have cut the royal budget, but in practice, they have increased it by 45%. The math is quite simple. 12% of $1.3 billion is still bigger than 25% of $550 million. So it's simple manipulation of facts. Look at the statement from the UK Treasury, and I'm quoting, "Cutting the rate to 12% is expected to reduce the sovereign grant by £24 million. This money will instead be used to fund vital public services for the benefit of the nation." And we thought China was good at propaganda. Let's be clear here. King Charles is not taking a pay cut. He is getting a massive hike, and that too in the middle of a cost of living crisis. Inflation in the UK is around 8%. Compare that to other G7 economies. In the US, inflation is 3%. In the Eurozone, around 5.5%. Japan, 3.3%, and Canada, 2.8%. So the UK is much worse than its peers. Earlier this month, they announced new packages for the NHS. That's the National Health Service, NHS. It's a publicly funded healthcare system. The NHS has around 1.2 million people on their payroll, doctors, nurses, administrators. Guess what their pay hike was? 5%. Inflation is 8%, but the pay hike was 5%. And these are the same people who worked 24/7 during the pandemic. They worked while UK officials partied at Downing Street. And their price? A 5% hike. Meanwhile, the 74-year-old with a made-up job gets 45%. I know it's an unfair world, but this is pushing it. The British royals already enjoy multiple financial privileges. For instance, they pay no estate taxes. In the UK, when you inherit highly valuable assets, you have to pay a tax, around 40%. But guess how much King Charles paid? 0%. So there are two questions to ask here. One, why does the royal family need all this money? They say it's for official purposes, like flying off to inaugurate something or buying ridiculously expensive clothes. Also, it's a big family. There are 10 full-time working royals. They keep traveling and they keep making public appearances, and all of this costs money. Question number two, do other royal families have budgets like these? Well, they do, but not this big. Monaco, for instance, spends around $54 million. The Netherlands, 49 million. Norway, also 49 million. And Belgium, 15 million. The less visible you are, the smaller your budget. Now, I know what the UK government will say. The monarchy is a symbol of national pride. They're doing very important work for which they are paid. Well, we completely disagree. Cutting ribbons is not exactly important work. Neither is giving away trophies at the Wimbledon. Someone else could do all of this, someone more deserving. These expenses occur because the royal family exists, because you invite them to do stuff. As for all the crown assets and land, let's not even get started. This vast estate was not built on merit or hard work. It was built on slavery and oppression. Rewarding them with a 45% pay hike is controversial at best, criminal in the times we live in. Back to India now. New Delhi hosted an important visitor today, Sri Lanka's President Ranil Wickremesinghe. He met Prime Minister Narendra Modi, also President Draupadi Murmu. This was Wickremesinghe's first trip to India after taking office as president. As always, two parts to it: the results and the politics. The results can be divided into three: connectivity, energy, finance. India and Sri Lanka have agreed to resume passenger ferry services. They will also increase the number of flights. One decision that stands out is a land bridge. Now, as you know, India and Sri Lanka are separated by water. The distance at one point is only 50 kilometers, 50. The idea is to link them. Both sides have agreed to conduct feasibility studies. So that's connectivity. Now to energy. An oil pipeline is being proposed between India and Sri Lanka. It is expected to cost around $4 billion. Now, pipelines are better than ships. They cost less and are more reliable for trading oil. India also agreed to pump more money into the Trincomalee tank farm. It's located in northern Sri Lanka. The plan is to turn it into a massive industrial and energy hub. Finally, economic cooperation. Sri Lanka had decided to use the rupee for bilateral trade. They will also use the UPI now. That's India's online payment system. So some important deals and decisions. But beyond that, what was the mood in New Delhi? A bit frosty, I would say. Wickremesinghe took charge in July last year. He had to wait 1 year, one whole year to visit India. Normally, Sri Lankan presidents do not take that long. Look at Wickremesinghe's predecessor, Gotabaya Rajapaksa. He took charge as president in November 2019. Within days, India's foreign minister paid him a visit. By the end of the month, Gotabaya had also flown to New Delhi. So 1 year is a long wait, and it tells you a story. The story of how India-Sri Lanka relations have changed. There is a new elephant in the room, or rather, a dragon. Wickremesinghe says his country will be neutral between India and China. Neutrality may sound okay for China, but for India, it is a downgrade. Colombo has historically been their sphere of influence, India's sphere of influence. But in the last decade, the dynamic has changed. Around 20% of Sri Lanka's external debt is to China. What's worse, they're playing hardball. All other lenders are negotiating together with Colombo, but not China. They say, let's settle this bilaterally. These loans and investments give China a lot of clout. Consider what happened last year. A Chinese spy vessel docked at the Hambantota port. India objected to this voyage, but Sri Lanka was powerless to stop it. So security and strategy are two big worries for India. Prime Minister Modi emphasized on this. Listen to this.
हमारा मानना है कि भारत और श्रीलंका के सुरक्षा हित और विकास एक दूसरे से जुड़े रहे हैं और इसलिए यह आवश्यक है कि हम एक दूसरे की सुरक्षा और संवेदनाओं को ध्यान में रखते हुए साथ मिलकर काम करें।
And how did Wickremesinghe respond to this? He said nothing about security. The Sri Lankan president was more focused on other things like economic cooperation and connectivity.
I believe that my visit to India has provided an opportunity to review our bilateral relationship, leverage the strength of geographical and civilization links, reinforce trust and confidence for our future prosperity in the modern world.
Where does this relationship go from here? Well, until last year, Sri Lanka was moving into China's grasp. The Rajapaksa brothers saw to that. But the protests gave India an opportunity. New Delhi gave financial aid worth $4 billion. The optics were good. China, the dangerous lender, and India, the helpful neighbor. But 1 year on, China has not disappeared from the island. In fact, they're back with a vengeance. In the month of May this year, a Chinese company bagged an important deal. They're developing a port complex in Colombo. So Sri Lanka's business with China is far from over. They may not like it, but they need that money. What can India do to counter this? For starters, the $4 billion assistance is history. We can't keep talking about it. Sri Lanka needs more investments and loans to reset their economy. But is India willing to splurge? Some of the deals signed today do signal some willingness. India is looking to invest in core infrastructure, things like connectivity and energy. But don't expect instant results. This is likely to be a long game of influence because Sri Lanka cannot abandon China overnight. And given the right investments and support, it could eventually happen. Also, India has something China does not have: long-standing people-to-people ties, centuries of shared culture, even religious links. If New Delhi can leverage that, things may speed up. It's not just a neighborhood. India is making diplomatic moves in faraway Latin America too. There are new synergies emerging. A defense deal is making headlines. Argentina wants to buy choppers from India. They have signed a letter of intent. This letter is with India's Hindustan Aeronauticals Limited, or HAL. It is a state-owned manufacturer. And what kind of choppers does Argentina want from HAL? Light and medium utility choppers. They'll be used by the Argentinian armed forces, but that's not the only thing that they're interested in. If reports are to be believed, Argentina wants 2 more Indian weapons: the Tejas fighter jet and the BrahMos missile. Recently, the defense minister was in India. His name is Jorge Enrique Tayana. He visited HAL's facilities in India. Look at this picture. It shows the minister sitting inside the cockpit of the Tejas aircraft. He also went to BrahMos Aerospace, which is the company that makes the BrahMos missile. Again, this is a state-owned entity, but it's a joint venture between Russia and India. Will Argentina buy the Tejas and the BrahMos? Too early to say, but going by some claims, the two sides have held discussions, and this follows the larger trajectory of India's defense industry. There is an obvious and sustained focus on exports. Recently, deals have been signed with the Philippines and with Indonesia. There too, the deal was for the BrahMos missile. But with Argentina, India's goals are more strategic. New Delhi wants a foothold in Latin America, and defense deals are a good way to achieve that. But why Latin America? What interests does India have in the continent? In the month of February, India's External Affairs Minister gave some insights. S. Jaishankar was delivering a speech at the India-Latin America conference. And he said, and I'm quoting, India's ambition to become a global power required a footprint in Latin America. He's right. In May this year, Jaishankar made a rare visit to the region. He visited 4 countries: Guyana, Panama, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic. This was the first time an Indian foreign minister visited these countries. There were no major outcomes, but this visit was the beginning of a dialogue, an attempt to win over some friends in the region. You see, India is positioning itself as a leader of the global south. It has raised the issues of the region. It has brought regional players to global forums like the G7 and the G20, for which India holds the presidency this year. And if India truly wants to champion the cause of the global south, it cannot leave out Latin America. The region's combined GDP is over $4 trillion. More than 660 million people live here. They represent about 8% of the world's population. So India cannot ignore this bloc, especially on global platforms like the United Nations. Because this is where votes from Latin American states continue to determine outcomes. India is pursuing a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. This is going to require reform, and such reforms, when they are put to vote, support from Latin American countries could come in handy. So building influence is necessary, and defense engagements are a tried and tested way to do that. In fact, India has done defense deals in the region in the past as well. It sold the Chetak helicopter to Suriname, military vehicles and trucks to Honduras, also to Argentina, Uruguay and Belize. There is a booming trade relationship as well. Last year, India's trade with Latin America was worth $50 billion. Evidently, New Delhi is investing in this relationship, but there are challenges. There is the tyranny of distance for one. This region remains largely inaccessible to India. There are virtually no direct flights. And that's a huge barrier when it comes to building trade ties. Also, China, as always, is a factor. Beijing got there first, and its influence in the region is strong and growing. I'll give you an example. Bilateral trade between China and Latin America is worth $450 billion. This was in 2021, $450 billion, 9 times that of India. So New Delhi must step up, and defense deals with Argentina are a significant step in that direction. And now let's move from drilling a hole in the planet to, metaphorically, drilling a hole in one's brain, because that's what education in the US state of Florida is beginning to sound like. It's the home state of the 2 top Republican presidential candidates, former US President Donald Trump, who moved there a few years ago, and Ron DeSantis, who's also the governor of Florida. Now, DeSantis is on the war path against common sense, it seems. I say this because of the state's new school curriculum and how the history of slavery will be taught in the US now. In Florida, teachers will have to teach students about the supposed benefits of slavery, yes, benefits of slavery, and how it helped slaves. We're not making this up. Here's a report.
Florida governor and U.S. Republican Party presidential candidate Ron DeSantis had once said, "Florida is where woke goes to die." But it seems like common sense is also meeting the same fate. And not just common sense, educational honesty and your conscience as well. Here's why. What do you usually think about when someone mentions slavery in the US? Millions of people from Africa forcibly brought to American shores. People brought in chains to work on plantations owned by white colonizers. Millions of deaths, rapes, and crimes against humanity. How people were robbed of their humanity and how they became the property of colonists. That's what actually happened. But according to Florida's Board of Education, it's not enough to know that and understand the horrors of slavery. No, they think you should also know about slavery's not often discussed benefits. They want students to know about, and I quote, how slaves developed skills which, in some instances, could be applied for their personal benefit. We're not making this up. That's a part of the state's new curriculum. It's part of the section describing the work slaves did. You know, the unpaid labor they were forced to do under the threat of beating, starvation, and death. Things like picking cotton in the scorching sun, or being forced to build a plantation owner's house, or sweep the colonists' floors while they made a fortune on the backs of slave labor. Yes, Florida wants its students to know how all of these atrocities were skill development programs for the slaves. They apparently want students to get the full picture. Let's think about this from the perspective of an Indian urban legend. The Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan allegedly chopped off the hands of the workers who built the iconic Taj Mahal. The myth goes that this was to stop them building anything as beautiful ever again. It's a legend that's used to highlight the horrors of unchecked power. Now imagine if someone narrating this story then went on to describe how the laborers also benefited from the act. That cutting off their hands led to them learning to write with their feet or with quills in their mouths. How it forced the laborers to develop a unique new skill that may have been used elsewhere. Does that not sound absurd and ridiculous? and downright disrespectful to those who have suffered. Which begs the question, what is Florida trying to do? There's also more in the new curriculum which seems like the state trying to justify slavery. The curriculum says students need to learn about slavery in other parts of the world. It talks about slave markets in Muslim countries, slavery in the Americas before European colonization, and even slavery in Asia. The Asian portion specifically mentions a law code from 4,000 years ago and the Indian caste system. All of this will go into showing students that slavery wasn't just an American phenomenon, which it wasn't. Slavery has existed throughout human history. It's a fact. But to indulge in the kind of whataboutery Florida wants to peddle is to deny the sheer scale of the transatlantic slave trade. It's an insult to the memories of the millions who lost their lives as slaves. So why is Florida doing this? The simple answer is politics. It seems Ron DeSantis wants to take a leaf out of North Korea's book. Brainwash children by teaching them a warped version of history. Remove their capacity for critical thinking by feeding them sanitized and incomplete information. With about 86% of Florida students subjected to this curriculum in public schools, DeSantis may just succeed in muddying the waters of history and the minds of children. Last year, he brought in a law called the Stop Woke Act. It seeks to ensure that no child feels guilt or anguish or psychological distress during lessons on topics like slavery in America. The new curriculum is just an extension of this war on common sense. Politicians should be forced to stay away from education. They will always have a motive when deciding what the public should be taught. So politicians should leave it to the professors, because subjects like slavery need nuance that forces us to confront the mistakes and horrors of our past while moving towards a brighter future. Because you know the old adage, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. But first, let me ask you a question. What happens when 500 large golden dogs meet in one place? It makes for the most adorable Vantage shot. Starting with the largest gathering of golden retrievers in history, where hundreds of golden-coated canines met in Scotland to celebrate the birth anniversary of the breed. A suspected underground gas explosion rocked South Africa's Johannesburg. It ripped open roads and overturned vehicles. The blast killed one and left dozens injured. After a period of calm, Peru's Ubinas volcano has resumed eruptions. And finally, what makes the 21st of July significant? We're taking you back to the year 1960 when Sirimavo Bandaranaike was elected the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. She broke the glass ceiling to become the world's first woman Prime Minister. We're leaving you with these images. Thanks for watching.
A bomb or something exploded.